Right, guys, let's get into this because what happened today just shattered every political expectation we had. I need you to lean in because the Supreme Court didn't just issue a ruling, they executed a constitutional intervention. They delivered the biggest, most searing, most decisive rebuke of presidential authority we've seen in decades, and it instantly blew up the legal foundation the Trump administration has been standing on. This is not a drill, and it's not a minor setback. But here's the part you won't believe, the twist that makes this entire story insane. Three of the justices who cast the deciding vote against the president were his own appointments. The
This is huge. The Supreme Court just delivered a bombshell ruling that fundamentally limits Trump's executive power. We're not talking about a minor procedural decision. This is the Supreme Court saying, no, you cannot unilaterally control key government actions without limits. They blocked his National Guard deployments. They're questioning his ability to fire federal officials without cause. This is a major judicial pushback against Trump's attempts to centralize power, and it's happening just months into what he thought would be an unchecked second term. And here's what makes this especially significant. Even conservative justices who usually side with Trump are showing skepticism about his expansive claims of authority. When you're losing justices you appointed, when the Supreme Court that's supposed to be your firewall is instead blocking your actions, that's a fundamental power shift. If you want to understand this landmark Supreme Court decision and what it means for the balance of power in American government, hit that subscribe button right now. Because we're about to break down how the highest court in the land just checked Trump's authoritarian ambitions and why this decision will reshape his entire presidency. Alright, let me explain exactly what the Supreme Court did because the implications are enormous. The court declined to suspend lower court injunctions blocking Trump's orders to deploy National Guard troops in urban areas. That's a direct rejection of Trump's claim that he has unlimited military authority on U.S. soil. Think about what that means. Trump has been trying to deploy federal troops to American cities over state objections. We've covered the D.C. lawsuit, the Portland and Chicago cases. And Trump kept arguing that as president, he has inherent authority to deploy troops wherever and whenever he wants for whatever reasons he deems necessary. The Supreme Court just said, no, you don't. By declining to suspend the lower court orders, they're letting those injunctions stand, which means Trump cannot deploy National Guard troops to cities that don't want them. His military power on U.S. soil has clear limits that courts will enforce. This decision curtails Trump's entire strategy of aggressive executive action. His playbook has been to issue bold orders, claim expansive presidential authority, dare courts to stop him, and appeal losses all the way to the Supreme Court, hoping his appointees will back him. But the Supreme Court is refusing to play along. The ruling raises fundamental questions about the legal scope of presidential authority. Can a president act unilaterally without congressional approval? Can executive orders override state sovereignty? Can the president deploy military force domestically without emergency justification? The court is answering no to these questions, or at least establishing limits. Justice Sonia Sotomayor publicly condemned aspects of the broader executive power doctrine as an existential threat to the rule of law. She's warning that unchecked presidential power undermines democratic governance. When a Supreme Court justice uses language like existential threat, that's not casual criticism. That's an alarm bell about constitutional crisis. And here's the really interesting part. Conservative justices showed signs of skepticism too. These are Trump appointees, justices who are generally sympathetic to executive authority, and even they're questioning Trump's claims. That reflects deeper tensions on the court about the boundaries of presidential power. So let's talk about what this ruling means beyond just the National Guard deployment issue. Because the Supreme Court isn't just deciding one case, they're establishing principles that will apply to all of Trump's executive actions. The decision intersects with Trump's ongoing legal battles across multiple fronts. The immunity fights, the obstruction cases, the regulatory authority disputes. All of these involve questions of presidential power. And the Supreme Court is signaling they won't give Trump unlimited authority. That's a major shift from what Trump expected. He appointed 3 justices specifically hoping they protect him from legal accountability and support expansive executive power. But the court is showing independence, enforcing limits, and refusing to rubber stamp Trump's actions. The impact on Trump's 2025 presidential agenda is massive. He came into this term planning to govern aggressively through executive orders, emergency declarations, and unilateral action. The Supreme Court is telling him that strategy won't work without legal and constitutional support. Regulatory constraints are real now. Trump can't just order agencies to do whatever he wants. Military constraints are enforced. He can't deploy troops wherever he wants. Legal constraints matter. Courts will block unconstitutional actions even when Trump appointees are on the bench. This emboldens opposition forces, states, Congress, advocacy groups to challenge Trump's orders. When the Supreme Court is willing to block him, lower courts become more confident in issuing injunctions. State attorneys general become more aggressive in filing lawsuits. The entire resistance infrastructure gets energized, and it signals to federal agencies and officials that they can push back against unlawful orders. If the Supreme Court says Trump doesn't have unlimited authority, that gives bureaucrats and officials legal cover to resist directives they believe are illegal or unconstitutional. The checks and balances system is being tested under enormous strain, but it's actually working. Courts are checking executive overreach. The judiciary is enforcing constitutional limits. The separation of powers isn't dead, even with Trump trying to concentrate authority. But there's also danger here. Trump has shown he's willing to defy court orders when convenient. What happens if he just ignores the Supreme Court? We'd be in full constitutional crisis territory. The court has power only if the executive branch respects and enforces its rulings. The political polarization around these judicial decisions is intense. Trump's supporters see this as activist judges blocking a democratically elected president. His opponents see it as necessary judicial restraint on authoritarian overreach. Those fundamentally different interpretations make compromise almost impossible. Before we get into what this means for Trump's political future in 2026, if you think the Supreme Court blocking Trump's power grabs is essential for democracy, go ahead and hit that like button. And drop a comment. Do you think the Supreme Court is right to limit presidential power, or is this judicial overreach blocking a strong president? Alright, so where does Trump go from here given this major Supreme Court setback? Because when your own appointees are limiting your power, you've got a serious political and legal problem. First, Trump's governance strategy has to change. He can't rely on unilateral executive action as his primary tool. He'll need to work more with Congress, negotiate more with states, build actual legal foundations for his policies. That's not Trump's style, but the Supreme Court is forcing it. The alternative is that Trump doubles down, keeps issuing aggressive orders, and dares courts to stop him over and over. But that leads to constant legal losses, injunctions, and headlines about Trump being blocked by courts. That's not a winning political strategy. The 2026 midterms are affected by this because voters are watching. Trump's base might be energized by seeing him as fighting against judicial obstruction, but moderate voters might see a president who keeps losing legal battles and conclude he's overreaching. Which narrative wins determines electoral outcomes. Republican politicians face a calculation. Do they defend Trump's expansive claims of authority even when the Supreme Court rejects them? That puts them at odds with the judiciary and potentially the Constitution. Or do they acknowledge limits on presidential power and risk Trump's wrath? The impact on Trump's legacy is significant. If his second term is defined by court losses, blocked initiatives, and judicial restraint on his authority, that's not the image of strength and dominance he wants. It's a narrative of a president checked and constrained by institutions. Future executive legislative dynamics are being shaped by this. If courts are willing to aggressively police presidential power when Trump pushes boundaries, that establishes precedent for limiting all future presidents. That could actually strengthen Congress and reduce executive overreach long term. But it could also lead to even more confrontation between branches. If presidents see courts as obstacles rather than partners in governance, they might look for ways to undermine or circumvent judicial authority. That's dangerous for rule of law and constitutional order. The practical question is whether Trump will comply with adverse court rulings. He's already shown willingness to delay, to find workarounds, to test limits. If he starts openly defying Supreme Court decisions, we're in unprecedented constitutional crisis territory. Lower courts are watching this closely. If the Supreme Court is willing to block Trump, district and appellate judges become more confident issuing injunctions against his policies. That creates a cascade of legal challenges that bog down Trump's agenda in litigation. Policymakers in states and localities see this as validation for resisting federal overreach. If the Supreme Court says Trump can't unilaterally deploy troops or override state authority, that emboldens state governments to challenge other federal actions they see as unconstitutional. Look, the bottom line is this. The Supreme Court delivered a bombshell ruling that limits Trump's executive power, blocks his National Guard deployments, and establishes that presidential authority has enforceable limits. This is a major power shift away from Trump and toward judicial and constitutional checks. Even Trump's own appointees are showing skepticism about his expansive authority claims. When you're losing justices you put on the court, that's a sign you've overreached. When the Supreme Court declines to suspend lower court orders blocking your actions, that's a defeat. This decision reshapes Trump's presidency. He can't govern through unilateral executive action without legal foundation. He can't deploy military force domestically over state objections. He can't fire federal officials without cause. All of these actions have limits that courts will enforce. The implications go beyond just Trump. This is about the balance of power in American government, about whether presidents can act like monarchs or must respect constitutional constraints, about whether courts can effectively check executive overreach, or whether presidential power is essentially unlimited. The Supreme Court is saying that checks and balances still matter, that separation of powers isn't dead, that there are limits on what any president, even one who appointed justices to the court, can do unilaterally. That's fundamental to constitutional democracy. So here's my final question for you. Do you think the Supreme Court is right to limit Trump's executive power, even when that limits his ability to implement his agenda? Or do you think courts shouldn't be able to block a democratically elected president from taking actions he believes are necessary? And what happens if Trump just ignores these court rulings? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is literally about the structure of American government and whether constitutional limits on power still exist. And make sure you're subscribed because Trump's response to this Supreme Court ruling and whether he'll comply or defy it is going to be one of the most important political stories going forward. This is a test of whether rule of law survives or whether presidential power becomes essentially unlimited. You need to stay informed about how this unfolds. Don't miss it.